Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy because we get a very limited amount of official data published by Russia. However, President Putin has just come out and confirmed that GDP growth in 2025 for Russia was only 1%, which is significantly lower than it has been in 2023 and 2024. Now, in terms of the official statement, this press release was published by TASS, the official Russian news agency. So there's no concept of me fudging the numbers here. I'm giving you the exact information that's been published by Russia. And this press release says Russian GDP add 1% in 2025. It says the Russian gross domestic product gained 1% in 25, President Vladimir Putin said when opening the first meeting on economic issues in 2026. His quote is, "I would like to note that the Russian GDP added 1% at the end of the last year. This is lower than dynamics observed before. We are well aware of that." So even President Putin is acknowledging that there's a significant slowdown in the Russian economy here. The press release goes on to say the Russian leader suggested discussing certain preliminary results of the national economy's functioning last year. His quote was, "Let us talk about the forecasts, about development with consideration of current factors, challenges and trends, and the situation in the domestic and international markets. And certainly, we will analyse in detail the mechanisms of achieving our goals in the economic sphere, support our growth required for confident dynamic development of the whole country," this head of state added. So apologies for the slightly unusual English here. This isn't me translating it. This is the official press release released in English by TASS. Now, if we have a look at this chart, it shows what's been happening with Russian GDP dating back to 2014. The reason I've gone back to 2014 was because that was the year when Russia invaded Crimea. And so it faced a number of sanctions at that time. So you can see that in the year after the invasion of Crimea, GDP fell into negative territory. It was down by 2%. We then saw 4 years of growth. We then had the COVID-19 pandemic, which affected every country in the world in 2020. So we had negative growth again. 2021 was the bounce back year for all countries, and 2022 was the year when Russia decided to invade Ukraine. So you can see that in 2022, we had a fall in GDP. However, in 2023 and 2024, Russia delivered 4.1% growth in GDP in both years. And that does seem remarkable given the fact that Russia was hit with so many sanctions. But if you follow the channel, you'll be fully aware that the way that Russia did that was by converting itself into what's known as a wartime economy. So lots of companies within Russia were recruited and they're now involved in the wartime effort. So they're producing things for the war in Ukraine and they're being paid directly by the Kremlin. So they're basically state sponsored. They've got guaranteed revenue as long as they deliver on all of the things that they need to produce. So that's really provided a major boost to Russia over the last couple of years. However, that boost is now coming to an end. The wartime economy can't go on forever because it's self-funded. The state is basically paying all of these companies to employ people and make things, but Russia is now running out of cash. And that's one of the reasons why GDP has now crashed down to 1%. You can see on the far right-hand side of this chart that the expectations at the beginning of 2025 was that Russia was going to hit around 2.5% growth. So 1% is way below where Russia should be. Now, just before we go on any further today, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscriber button? It really helps me with the algorithm. And also, I wanted to remind you that I'm currently running my competition whereby you can win my house or £250,000 in cash. But I need you to buy some tickets in order for me to actually fund that competition. So have a look at the QR code on the screen now or the link in the description below. Now, if we go on to look at some of the other things that President Putin has talked about, this is another press release from TASS relating to the same presentation, and it says inflation managed to be lowered to 5.6% by the end of 2025. So his quote here is, while the rise in prices totaled 9.5% in 2024, this indicator was managed to be lowered to 5.6% at the end of last year. So, once again, apologies for the slightly broken English here. This is TASS's translation. He went on to say, we understand how important is the moderate, predictable price dynamics for the welfare of Russian families, for operation of plants and organizations, for public finances, and for the investment process, for investment plans. So, what he's saying here is that inflation is an important metric. And one of the reasons why GDP only grew at 1% is because the Russian central bank had to manage inflation. And it does that by pushing up interest rates. And interest rates are extremely high in Russia at the moment. If we have a look at what's been going on with inflation over the past 5 years, this is one of the major problems that is going to impact on the future of the Russian economy. You can see, if we look at the scale on the right hand side here, it goes from 0 at the bottom to 20% at the top. And you can see that since the invasion of Ukraine, Russia has experienced extremely high levels of inflation. Immediately following the invasion of Ukraine, it was up above 16%. It remained in double digits throughout the whole of 2022 and the first part of 2023. We then saw a remarkable fall, which nobody can really explain. And when you take a step back and look at the shape of this chart, it doesn't really make any sense. So I won't spend too much time talking about that. But you can see that since the invasion of Ukraine started, inflation has been pretty much above 7 or 8% for the whole time. And at some periods, it's been double that. And as we've talked about before, the problem you have with long-term high inflation is that it's cumulative. So if prices go up by 10% this year, and then 10% next year, and 10% the year after, and 10% the year after that, then within a short space of time, you've got prices that are 50 to 60% higher than they were a few years ago. So clearly, you would need your wages to be going up at the same rate in order to maintain your standard of living, and that hasn't been happening. So people in Russia have found that the cost of living has gone up, standard of living has gone down. So President Putin has acknowledged that inflation is a key metric that needs to be addressed. And it's interesting that in his statement, he's referring back to 9.5% inflation in 2024. So he's basically trying to say that 5.6% this year is pretty decent, when in reality it isn't. It's very high, and it's a lot higher than the target rate of 4%. Now, the Russian central bank, and this is another press release from TASS at the same day, the Russian central bank is targeting 4%. And it released this statement, which says the response of prices to the rise in taxes and tariffs in January carries risks of high inflation expectations. Now, that relates to the increase in VAT from 20% to 22% that took place on the 1st of January. That's going to push up prices across the board in Russia by at least 2%. The press release goes on to say, in its turn, it may elongate the inflation tail from the January price hike and slow down further decline of price growth rates. It requires further prudence when making the decision on the monetary policy to exclude the new round of the resilient acceleration of the rise in prices and a rising requirement to increase the key rate. Now, apologies for the broken English there, but let me translate it into real English. What the Russian central bank is saying is that the rise in taxes is going to accelerate inflation. And that means that the Russian central bank is going to have to counter that by adjusting interest rates. So it finally goes on to say further inflation lowering to 4% and its stabilization at the target level require keeping the monetary policy tough. So that's basically saying we can't lower interest rates if we want to manage inflation. And if we have a look at what's been happening to interest rates in Russia over the past 5 years, the scale on the right-hand side of this chart goes from 0 to 24%. And you can see that since the invasion of Ukraine, interest rates have been at elevated levels. They were initially increased to 20% as an emergency action following the invasion. They came back down to 7.5% in 2023. However, since the middle of 23, we've seen a huge increase in interest rates. They actually got up above 20% in 2025. and they're now sitting at 16%. And the problem that you've got with long term high interest rates like this is that it discourages companies from taking on debt to expand. So, in the normal course of events, if you're running a business and it's going quite well, then you might think, well, if I can add another production line or another factory or just hire more staff, then I could make more profit. So, in order to do that, you would take on debt to pay for all of that. And then over the longer term, you start reaping the benefits, you bring in more cash, bring in more profit. And so that's how businesses grow. They don't tend to grow just from cash flow because it takes too long. It's a bit like you buying a property. You'll take on a mortgage because it takes too long to build up all of the cash to buy it outright. So you take on the mortgage, you earn more money as you go along through your life, you pay the mortgage off, jobs are good. And that's what happens in business. But it's not happening in Russia, and it hasn't been happening over the past 4 years because of the prohibitively high interest rates. And what happens over the long term is that that starts to damage GDP. And that's exactly what we're seeing happening right now. GDP has been boosted in 23 and 24 because of this switch to the wartime economy. But that can't go on forever. And what we're seeing now with this 1% growth in 25 is that the wartime economy has run out of steam. It can't carry on. Now, interestingly, as part of his statements, and this again goes into the broken English, but President Putin made this comment about employment. He said, I request colleagues to pay greater attention to improvement of the employment structure in the economy. It is important for us to make it more efficient on account of creating modern, decently paid jobs in sectors with high labour productivity. So, what he's saying there, if I can read between the lines, is that Russian businesses need to start hiring more people. But the problem that they've got is that there aren't enough people in Russia to go around. And there's an indication here that the wartime economy may not carry on and that Russian companies need to start creating more jobs. But I'm not sure who's going to fill those jobs. If we have a look at this chart, it shows the unemployment rate in Russia over the past 5 years. And as you can see, it's come down hugely. 5 years ago, unemployment was sitting at close to 6%. It's now down to 2.1%. And whilst you might think, well, that indicates good news, doesn't it, for the economy because there's less people unemployed, it isn't actually the situation in Russia because they haven't got enough people. And what's been happening is that the companies that are being sponsored by the Kremlin are stealing staff from other businesses because they're offering higher wages because they've got guaranteed revenue. They don't have to worry about marketing and sales. They know that they're going to get paid as long as they produce all of the things that they need to for the war in Ukraine. So that's meant that people have been moving from the commercial companies to the state sponsored companies. The commercial companies are then having to increase their wages to try to attract in people. So the unemployment rate has gone down. But Russia is now running out of bodies. It doesn't have enough people to fill all of the jobs. And that's a major problem because you need to have more employment to drive up GDP. So that's one of the factors that's holding Russia back. In terms of where the Russian economy is sitting at the moment, I thought it was worth having a look at some of the key indicators because these link in to future growth. So if we look at, and I've compared this to the United States because I think it's obviously the biggest economy in the world, and it's useful to sort of see what's going on in the US and compare that to what's happening in Russia. So if we look at inflation, it's currently sitting at 5.6% in Russia, which is 1.6% higher than the target level of 4%. And as we saw, it's coming off the back of 5 years of high rates. If we look at what's going on in the USA, it's currently sitting at 2.7%. So that's less than half of what it is in Russia. And long-term inflation damages long-term growth. So that's not good news. It's not a good indicator for Russia for what's going to happen in 26 and 27. If we look at interest rates, they're currently sitting at 16% in Russia compared with 3.5 to 3.75% in the States. So the US's interest rates are more than 4 times lower what they are in Russia. And what that means is that companies in the US are happy to take on debt at those sort of levels to expand and grow and therefore grow GDP and the economy. At 16%, nobody in Russia wants to take on debt. But the problem that Russia has is that interest rates need to stay high to keep inflation lower. So if interest rates were lowered, then inflation would start to go up again. And it's already going up because of what's happening with VAT and also the sanctions. If we look at the unemployment rate, it's at 2.1% in Russia right now, compared with around 4.5% in the US. But 2.1% is actually too low. Russia needs more people to fill jobs to create growth. And if we look at the prospects, this is the estimate provided by Russia for 2026. It's estimating to achieve growth of probably around about 1%. Again, 0.8 to 1.3 is the range, compared with around 2% in the US. And the US is in a much stronger position because its metrics are far healthier. And if we have a look at what's been happening with GDP, I thought it was worth doing a final comparison to between the two countries. So we call 2021 the base year because that was the year when we bounced back from the COVID-19 pandemic. So if we say that GDP in 2021 is the index here, so set it at 100. In 2022, Russia experienced a fall of 1.2% in GDP. So its index came down to 98.8. And then in the following 3 years, we have seen growth of 4.1% in 23 and 24, and then 1% in 2025. So over the past 4 years, Russia's GDP index has increased from 100 to 108.1. Over the same period, the USA, which has seen consistent growth, it hasn't had any negative GDP growth, it's grown its GDP index to 111.2, so significantly higher than Russia. But the point here is that the USA is well placed to continue growing at the sort of levels that it's been achieving over the past 4 years. However, Russia is severely weakened, and with high levels of inflation, high interest rates, and very low levels of unemployment, which means that it doesn't have enough people, it's really going to struggle to continue growing at any significant level over the next few years. And this is all coming at the same time as Russia is continuing to spend more than it's earning. It's spending more because of the war in Ukraine. So it's having to fund that deficit from its savings. So the National Wealth Fund is now almost depleted. It's now selling gold in order to keep funding the war in Ukraine. So the point of this video really was to highlight what's happening with GDP, talk about the fact that the growth has now slowed significantly because we're now getting back to real growth. You can't keep funding the wartime economy forever because it costs a lot of money to do that, and Russia is now running short of funds. So the slow level of growth will cause a bigger deficit in the annual budget. So that's going to cause major problems for Russia. It's going to mean that it's going to have to fund the war in Ukraine from all of its savings, and that's just not a sustainable situation. And when you look at the metrics, the key fundamentals in the economy, Russia is severely damaged by what's happened over the past 4 years. And until the war in Ukraine comes to an end, it's going to continue damaging Russian growth and Russian GDP and ultimately the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. That's what I'm trying to do, get you to start thinking about things in different ways. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. I'm trying to push up my subscriber numbers. Don't forget, I'm currently running my competition whereby you can win my house or £250,000. It's another way of funding the channel, but I need people to buy tickets in order to be able to hit the target and close out that competition. So if you could help out, that'd be great. Please scan the QR code on the screen now or look at the link in the description below. Thank you so much to everyone that's supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks, really appreciate that. It really does help to keep me funded and keep me going. And if you're a long-term supporter, either through Patreon or YouTube membership, thank you so much for that long-term support. That really does help to keep me focused on making as many videos as I can. And here's something to put a smile on your face.